Security is absolutely critical for your wireless networks. As a network administrator, you must secure your wireless data. You can do this by implementing authentication and encryption. Let's begin with authentication because that's one of the first things that happens when you connect a device to a wireless network. Authentication is the process of proving identity. There are three authentication methods for wireless networks. The first is open system authentication. Open system authentication requires a MAC address to connect to the wireless access point. By default, all MAC addresses are allowed. Open system authentication doesn't require the client system to provide its credentials to the access point during authentication. Using open authentication, any client system can send a request to the access point, be authenticated, and then connect to the wireless network. In effect, open system authentication isn't authentication at all because no real authentication occurs. But you can implement a minimal level of security on a wireless access point by implementing MAC address filtering so that certain MAC addresses are rejected when they try to connect. The next type of authentication used for wireless network is 802.1x authentication. 802.1x implements usernames and passwords for authentication. With 802.1x authentication, the authentication method is negotiated when a connection is established between the client and the wireless access point. The client sends the authentication credentials, usually in the form of a username and password. The wireless access point itself doesn't perform authentication. Instead, it forwards the authentication credentials to a special authentication server, for example, a Radius server. The Radius server maintains information about user accounts and conditions for account access. When the user logs on, the authentication information is passed to the Radius server, which looks up the user account and validates the password. It may also use other information to impose additional restrictions on the connection. For example, you could implement time of day restrictions to restrict access to the wireless network during certain periods of the day. The Radius server then sends information back to the access point to tell it whether the access is granted or denied. 802.1x authentication also requires the use of certificates. The authentication server must have a certificate that identifies it as a server that can perform authentication. With 802.1x, you can use authentication methods other than usernames and passwords. For example, you can use a certificate on the wireless device. You could also use a smart card, which provides a certificate and only allows access to users with smart cards. Implementing authentication is only one part of securing a wireless network. There are still a few more steps. Let's move on to encryption. To protect unencrypted channels, you need to encrypt all signals on the wireless network. Encryption protects a wireless network by encoding wireless communications before they're transmitted. This way, even if someone captures a signal, there's nothing they can do with it because the data is encrypted. Encryption requires senders and receivers to have some type of key to encrypt and decrypt the communications. The third type of authentication is shared key authentication. Shared key authentication is a four-way challenge response handshake that occurs between the wireless client and the wireless access point and requires all wireless devices on the network to be pre-configured with the same key. First, the client sends an authentication request to the wireless access point. The access point replies to the workstation that wants to authenticate with a clear text challenge. Then the client encrypts the challenge text using the pre-configured pre-shared key and sends it back to the WAP in another authentication request. Finally, the access point decrypts the material it receives and compares it with the clear text it sent in the first place. If the decryption process was accurate and the text is correct, the access point will send back a positive response, and the association between the client and the access point is created. If the decryption fails, it sends back a negative response and rejects the connection request. Next, let's look at WPA and WPA2. WPA stands for Wi-Fi Protected Access. It uses the Temporal Key Integrity Protocol, or TKIP. WPA provides dynamic key generation and dynamic key rotation. This ensures that the network never uses the same key over and over. Instead, each packet gets a unique encryption key. TKIP uses the Ribus Cipher 4, or RC4, to encrypt and encase the data packets that are transferred. WPA also offers better authentication than older protocols because wireless clients have to authenticate to the wireless access point before they're allowed to connect. Unfortunately, even WPA is crackable. Exploits that can break WPA encryption are published on the internet. Whether these exploits are effective depends on one thing: the length of the passphrase you use to set up WPA. If you use a very long passphrase with just regular WPA, it makes it harder to break the encryption. If you use a short passphrase, then the encryption is crackable. If you're going to set up a wireless network that has any type of secure information on it, then you really should have WPA2. WPA2 provides the highest level of wireless security because it uses an encryption algorithm called Advanced Encryption Standard, or AES. AES is a more complex cipher than older ciphers like RC4. AES can be used with either TKIP or the Cipher Blockchaining Message Authentication Protocol, CCMP. But CCMP provides you with the highest level of security. CCMP is an improvement on TKIP for a few reasons. It has a larger block size for encryptions and a larger key size. It also has stronger algorithms that require more resources to run. Using CCMP in conjunction with AES ensures a higher level of security than TKIP and RC4. Both WPA and WPA2 support both open authentication and 802.1x authentication. 802.1x authentication is typically used in larger organizations where authentication is required. This option requires additional hardware or more complex configuration tasks. In addition to implementing encryption and authentication, there are several other options you can use to secure a wireless network. First, always be sure to change the default administrator password on your access points. Most wireless access points come pre-configured with a default administrative password to enable easy initial configuration. However, be aware that the default passwords for most access points are published on the internet and are easily accessible. This allows malicious individuals to connect to your wireless access point and change its configuration. Another thing you can do is change the default SSID, or better yet, disable SSID broadcasting completely. This technique obscures your wireless network so that casual observers can't detect it. But a more determined attacker can still detect the network and identify the SSID by capturing packets that are being exchanged on the wireless network. Another thing you can do is enable MAC address filtering. This option restricts access to the wireless network to only devices with specific MAC addresses that you configure. Again, this makes your network harder to compromise, but it won't stop a determined hacker. The attacker can still monitor the radio signals from your network and identify MAC addresses that are allowed. Then they can reconfigure their own devices to use those allowed MAC addresses. Another thing you should do periodically is update the firmware on your access points. As security threats become known, manufacturers often release fixes that plug those holes to prevent attacks. Finally, you can enable the firewall on your wireless access point to allow access to only certain IP addresses or certain devices and allow communication in only certain directions. You can also limit access on a network by using geofencing. Geofencing is a virtual fence that allows devices to connect to the network based on their geographic location. You can determine what kind of access is given based on location. You can use radio frequency technology and GPS to indicate when a device is within the geofence and allow that device to connect only when within the virtual fence. Now let's review what we've discussed. In this lesson, we talked about using authentication to protect a wireless network and using encryption to protect data that's being transmitted on the wireless network. We specifically looked at open system authentication, 802.1x authentication, and shared key authentication. Then we discussed using additional security measures to protect a wireless network, like disabling SSID broadcast, changing default passwords, filtering MAC address, updating access point firmware, implementing a firewall on access points, and implementing geofencing.